The content of this podcast is based on medical fact and evidence-based practice from credible, authoritative sources, but is not a substitute for your institution's policies, procedures, common sense, or good judgment. The views and opinions are those of Eric Bauer and FlightBridgeED in their entirety. This is the FlightBridgeED Podcast, critical care and emergency medicine education for nurses and paramedics. Here's your host, Eric Bauer.
Hey everybody, Eric back with you. Today we're going to do a podcast on a concept called time constant. Well, what is time constant? Well, when we approach mechanical ventilation, we set our ventilator up, we set an I time, and we try to guide that I time off of an ID ratio that's going to be set to optimize their overall inhalation and exhalation time. And we know we do that based on their disease process. But did you know that there's a true way to try to identify what the patient needs? And your ventilator will actually tell you what that is. You have to do a little bit of math. It's not that bad. But it will actually tell you and guide you to set your exhalation time on your ID ratio. So time constant. When we think about providing mechanical ventilation, we know as providers that our patients have all different types of disease process. Their lung characteristics are different. Their anatomical differences as far as their height and their weight. All those things play into overall lung compliance and resistance. And when we think about normal compliance and normal resistance, right, that's a perfect world, but we know our patients aren't in that perfect world. So our patients kind of lie in a world where they have a pathophysiologic change of some sort, and so they may have either an increased amount of resistance, they may have a poor compliance. So why is that important? Because this affects how our patients, how those little lung units, how do they rapidly fill and empty? I want you to imagine holding up a kind of a bunch of grapes. And those grapes are illustrating little tiny balloons, little air sacs. And inside each one of those grapes, I want you to imagine another little cluster of grapes. Those are your little alveoli, those little lung units. And so each of these little air sacs will fill with volume, and based on the patient's physiologic compliance and the overall resistance, that's going to dictate overall volume. So if we have a lung unit that has normal compliance and normal resistance, it will fill at a normal length of time and with a normal amount of volume. So the overall filling time and volume are going to be normal. In contrast, if that little lung unit has normal resistance, but let's say the compliance is poor, so you have a stiff air sac or air unit, that little lung unit is actually going to inflate very rapidly, but it's going to be limited on volume, so you're going to have less volume. So I want you to kind of consider what I just said. If you have poor compliance, you're going to have rapid inflation, but you're going to have a low volume. And this is exactly why we always talk about pressure control ventilation being a compliance-based mode. Compliance equals volume. So remember that, compliance equals volume. If your compliance is low, your volume is going to be low. And that's why pressure control ventilation doesn't cause compliance to get worse. It actually kind of protects the lungs so you don't cause overinflation. So if we use an example, right? Imagine your kids are, you have a child that's got a birthday and you have a pack of balloons and you grab one of those balloons and you try to blow that up. And if you've ever done this, you know that initial attempt to blow that up is very difficult. And that means that you have a normal amount of resistance. The resistance isn't the problem, but the actual overall compliance of that balloon, because it's never been inflated, is actually poor. And so once you overcome what's called that critical opening pressure, that's called driving pressure, the balloon starts inflating, and then all of a sudden you have this rapid inflation. So, imagine that above patient had an I time of 1 second. We're not going to worry about the whole ID ratio right now. We're just going to say a 1 second I time. In contrast, I want you to imagine that that little lung unit has a normal compliance, but a high airway resistance. So in this example, the lung unit fills very, very slowly because the resistance, let's say we have this balloon that we're trying to inflate, but that balloon has a tiny little stir straw, one of those little coffee stir straws, and we have to try to blow through that little stir straw to inflate that balloon. How long is that going to take to fill that balloon? Well, the resistance is really, really high, and let's say that the compliance is normal. In this example, the lung unit's going to fill very, very slowly, and the airway, because it's narrow and the flow is hindered, you're going to have a very, very slow filling time. So if we imagine this patient with an I time of 1 second, what is going to happen? Well, because it takes longer to fill because of airway resistance, you're going to have a smaller volume. I mean, we're talking a very, very, very small volume. So you're going to have a hypoventilation situation. So this is where, when we look at a sick lung, our patients that we transport have poor compliance, they have high airway resistance. This leads us to the point of this podcast is we can't just arbitrarily pick the same I time for every patient. And we know that I time results in an ID ratio. That's where we get into the concept of time constant. Essentially, time constant means the length of time it takes for lung units to fill or empty. So this is the product of overall resistance divided by flow. Well, what does that mean? Well, our resistance can be calculated very easily. Our resistance is the product of our peak inspiratory pressure minus our P-plat. So again, our peak inspiratory pressure minus our P-plat, that's called RAW, or resistance. And then we divide that by our overall flow. Now, the overall flow is given to you on the ventilator. It's given to you on the ventilator in liters per minute. And all we have to do is we have to convert that to liters per second. That's very easy to do. We'd have to just do a little math, and it's just dividing that liters per minute by 60 seconds. And that will give you a liters per second calculation. So time constant is actually not that difficult to calculate. As I said in the earlier part of the podcast, I'm going to have a worksheet. That worksheet is going to be in the show notes. I would love everybody to download that worksheet and go through the steps and practice this. And then we'll actually post the answers as well, and you can actually check your math and see if you have everything correct. So let's go through the calculation. The formula is as follows. So we need to, number one, evaluate resistance. And again, that is going to be your PIP minus your P-plat. And so again, you're going to have a PIP of, for example, 20, a P-plat of 10. So we're just going to subtract those, and we're going to have an answer of 10. So that is your raw. And then you divide that by your flow in liters per second. And as I said, your flow, your ventilator is going to give you whatever that inspiratory flow is. Divide that by 60, and that gives you liters per second. So what is time constant referring to? A time constant of 1 means that we have 63% of the volume that has been put into those little lung units, either inhaled or exhaled, in 1/10 of a second, or 0.1. Time constant of 2 means we have 86% of the overall volume inhaled or exhaled. Time constant of 3 is, again, 0.3 of a second or 0.3. And that means that's the time it takes for 95% of the volume to be either inhaled or exhaled. That's actually the goal we're looking for. We're going to utilize a time constant of 3 in most of our patients. We can actually increase that a little bit. We can go with time constant of 4, meaning that it takes 0.4 of a second or 0.4 for 98% of the overall volume to be inhaled or exhaled. And then a time constant of 5 means that we have 100% of the volume actually inhaled or exhaled. Now, I think that the thing about this is, we don't need to be perfect. We don't have to be 100%. And that's where 95% is that golden number. So how does this calculate? Let's do an example. Let's say your overall patient's inspiratory flow is 40 liters per minute. So again, that is going to be given to you on all your ventilators. It'll tell you what the flow is. On the Ravel, it actually shows as V as in Victor peak. LTV 1200 the same way. The Hamilton is going to show as flow, inspiratory flow. So we have 40 liters a minute. We divide that by 60 for 60 seconds. And we actually get right around 0.66 liters per second. We can round that up to 0.7. As I said, the product of overall resistance is pip minus p flat. So let's say we have a pip of 20 and a p flat of 15. We make that subtraction, we actually have a resistance of 5 centimeters of water. And to calculate your overall time constant, it's the product of resistance divided by flow. So we've already made the small little calculations. We've evaluated and identified what our flow is. We've divided that by 60 seconds. We've evaluated what our overall resistance is. That's going to be 5 centimeters of water. And so we make that calculation. We have resistance of 5 divided by 0.7, and that gives us 7. Now, we have to then make one more little calculation, and that's going to be whatever time constant you're going to want to use. And as I said, we're always going to use 3. So we're going to multiply 7, that's our answer, remember, of our resistance divided by our flow. We have 7 left over, and we just multiply 7 by 0.3 as 0.3, meaning 0.3 of a second. And our answer is 2.1 seconds of overall expiratory time. So this, again, is guiding your overall therapy when it comes to what is your E time. What I want you to kind of start thinking about is it's not about 1 to 2 for the normal adult, 1 to 3 for pediatrics, 1 to 4 for obstruction. I think that's a very easy way to get your ventilator initially set up. But this is going to be able to help you fine-tune those really tough patients. We want at least a time constant of 3. We don't necessarily need to go 4 or 5. And as I said, we have a worksheet, and this worksheet has 5 different problems, different flow settings. Remember, some ventilators, especially the transport side, will actually change the flow based on your overall tidal volume. So, that's one of the limitations that we have in transport mechanical ventilation, that in the hospital setting, these ventilators allow, just changing the flow up or down. Hamilton T1 will actually allow you to change the flow up or down. The Ravel, the LTV 1200, the Impact, those ventilators change flow based on your overall tidal volume. So your inspiratory flow, I've got different inspiratory flows. I've got different pips, different P-plats, and I have this all broke down. I highly recommend you practice this. I think if you do, 4 or 5 problems, this will be kind of set in your memory. You can write down a few little things, put it in a field guide, and keep it with you. And this isn't something that I think that you have to do on every single patient. I think that, it's good habit to maybe practice this and do this, and then it'll become second nature, and it'll give you a little bit better ability to maybe optimize your patient's expiratory ability. And I think that that's a great thing. Anytime we place a patient on the ventilator, we know that their expiratory ability, their ability to get rid of that volume out of those little lung units is always inhibited because we're changing the way we breathe. We breathe based on a negative interthoracic pressure, and now we completely flip that, and we're providing positive pressure ventilation. Although it's different than, standard BVM ventilations, it's still a different physiology, and we have to be able to evaluate that. So I think it's pretty interesting when you start doing some of these problems and realize, based on maybe a high resistance or a low resistance, a high flow or a low flow, what your overall expiratory time really needs to be. I think it'll be enlightening, and I think it'll allow you some clarity maybe on some areas that maybe you struggled with patient care when it came to mechanical ventilation. So again, I will put this in the show notes, and please go to the website, www.FlightBridgeED.com, find the podcast, open up that overall section. At the very bottom of that area, you'll see show notes, and I'll have those two PDFs. I'll have one that says practice. I recommend downloading that first. Right? Don't cheat. And then go back, and I'll have the answers actually posted as well. You can pull that up. If you want to pull them up both at the same time, that's absolutely fine, and kind of use it as a reference, see if you're doing this correctly. But I feel like the examples I've used, the practice in the very beginning is set up in a way that you should be able to understand. If you match this with a podcast, I did have Tyler Christofoli kind of look this over, get a second set of eyes, so I really want to thank him, and he brought up a few great points, and I think that's where you kind of get better as you bounce things off different people. You have other people look at your work and make sure it's valid, make sure that you haven't made a mistake, and so I want to thank him for that. As always, if you have any ideas for podcasts, I have a few pending that have come from our listeners. Please email me or text me if you have my number, and I will definitely look at putting those podcasts in our overall library. And that's all I have. Until next time, we will talk to you soon. Hey guys, if you're like me, you're constantly on the go. The last thing you're thinking of is actually tracking your certifications. When is something going to expire? We know that these are dependent on our job. Well, I think I found the solution. I found an app called PSET, and PSET is an app that allows me to enter in all my certifications by title. I can put issue and expiration dates. I can take a picture front and back. I can then share these with people if I needed to share this with a training officer or a colleague. Everything is organized in a database format, very easily accessible. I highly recommend you check this out. You can find this and download this for Android device users on your Google Play or for iPhone users on your App Store. Again, it's called PSET. Check it out. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me.
This has been a production of the FlightBridgeED Podcast, leading the way in pre-hospital critical care and emergency medicine education.